You're listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent talk.
Happy Friday evening, folks. Welcome to the show. This is Scotty Roberts. You're watching and listening to the Intrepid radio program right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com. Go on over and take a look at all the goodness that is Odyssey Radio. At the same time, come on over to my YouTube channel and watch the show, the video simulcast of this program, and it's over on youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. And so come on over, find my channel. You can find over 320 archived shows since we've been on Odyssey Radio, plus a whole lot of other stuff, my paranormal stuff, stuff I've done with Rocky and John Ward. There is all kinds of stuff about my family, about my trips to Egypt and things like that. So come on over, take a look at my YouTube channel, watch some videos, spend some time there. And then also on my channel, you're going to encounter right now the live chat room, which is going on right now, inhabited by brother and sister Intrepids. So come on over, join the conversation. Watch the video, listen to Odyssey Radio while you do that in simulcast, and let's go. Let's have a good time of it tonight. So it's Friday night, it's the end of the week, and you know, even though I work here and I'm here all the time in my studio, at my desk, at my computer, doing the things that help bring bread and butter in and keep the lights on over here, still, the weekend is always kind of nice because there's not as many people that bug you during the weekend for stuff. And I mean bugging you in a positive way. You know, while you might be here and available, there's not always somebody looking for you on the weekend to do something for you. And so it's kind of nice with the weekend coming up. Happy Friday. And tonight I want to talk more about this God stuff. And I put it in that category because we've all got a concept of who we think God is or isn't, or that God doesn't exist at all, so we don't have to consider it at all. I kind of think that the people who don't believe that there is some higher power have either, it's because of there's probably a handful of reasons. One, they were never taught that there was a higher power. If nobody ever told you since you were a small child that there was a God out there, would you believe that there was one? The Bible itself says something about you say you don't believe, even the very rocks and the mountains cry out that there is a God. So maybe we would stumble on that. How do you think our ancestors stumbled on it? Did they all have epiphanies, personal experiences meeting God face to face? Or a prophet of some kind did, and he brought it back to his tribe and said, there is a God, I've seen him, I've met him. What about Moses? I met him face to face in a burning bush. I took the sandals off my feet because it was hallowed ground. That was his story, and he's going to stick to it. You know, there's lots of people out there. I think of Whitley Strieber comes to mind, who wrote the books Communion and Transformation and wrote about his UFO experiences. And has become very well known, not because before that he was a thriller author. Some of his books had become movies, but because of this, he's become very well known in certain communities. But Whitley Strieber is one of those people. He is somebody who had an experience with aliens. And to him, that's real. It exists. He was there. Is he just a liar? Did he just fabricate it all? Because he's a novelist. Does he have the ability to make that story up? Sure he does. Did he? Like guys like Travis Walton, the same thing with his UFO experiences. They made the movie Fire in the Sky, loosely based on his experiences. And so, all I'm saying is that does our experience in believing that a God exists have to go back to being taught? Or did we have an encounter? Would we come to those conclusions, maybe not the same terminology, the same proper names, the same titles and things like that, but would we come to those conclusions on our own if nobody had ever told us that God exists? Maybe we were raised in a situation where we were taught that God exists, but we became overwrought by the politics of the church or the control factors of the church or the synagogue, if you will. I've never heard too many people say that they worry about the control factor in the synagogue, but I'm sure it exists to a certain extent. Religions that are organized have control factors about them. Are those the things that drove us away from believing that God exists? Does science tell you that God doesn't exist? Can science prove he does or doesn't? No, but there's not a point in proving a negative. If you make an assertion that there is a God, well, show the evidence. Show how science can verify that. I don't think they can. There's certain veils we cannot pierce. Does that mean God does exist or does not exist? Does it mean he does exist, but he's like the purple dragon that floats in my garage? Remember that analogy of Carl Sagan's. And so here's the questions that we're left with. And then for those of you who believe and you don't see a lot of evidence of God, the evidence of God is in your heart. You accept it, you believe it, you structure your life by it, you structure your hopes of the afterlife on it. Yet you have no way to prove it to yourself other than by, this is what I have always believed, and I've seen God's grace grow greater and greater in my life, and the reality of Jesus, the reality of God, the reality of his angels, and so on. Those are the things that increase for us when we believe them, and we put those things to practice. But can I ask you, how many years have you believed that, and how much have you seen that has evidenced those things? Does God leave himself unevidentiary? That's the right way to use that. Unevidenced. Why does God, let's pose that in a question. Why does it seem God leaves himself so unevidenced? And people might say, I see the evidence of God everywhere. Look at the waterfall. Look at the clouds in the sky. Look at the night stars. Look at my family. Look at this and that. You can see those things, but you can attribute all of that to a God. But does that prove that there is a God to you? Only if you accept that those are the things that are evidences of God. What is the evidence that God came down and walked on the earth? What is the evidence that God left the tracks in your snow on your front sidewalk step? Or in the sand on your beach? We don't know those things. That's why we come to this question that we started talking about yesterday from a different way around. The whole idea of a sleeping God. Is God asleep? Has he quit? Is he away on a break? Is he taking a vacation? Has he stopped caring about mankind and left mankind to his own? Or does he not exist? How do we explain those things away? Field guy last night, I can't remember if it was the radio show. No, it was the afterword. And by the way, thank you for everybody who came. We had more people in the live afterward than we had viewing the show last night. And so in that live afterward, we asked some of these questions. And we asked about God. And Field Guy said something about, I have it in our chat room. He said, I have a tough time believing in a God that would allow bad things to happen on this earth and to humans. In essence, that was, and I hope, Field Guy, over in the chat room, that I'm doing justice to your question. It was simplistic, or it was more a statement. And I said, I don't know, even though I struggle with the existence of God, I struggle with religion and faith, I don't know that I agree with Field Guy that God allows bad things to happen as much as perhaps God is not engaged. And that's where I said maybe I am a practical deist. I am one who says God wound up the alarm clock and set it on the shelf and went fishing or went to do his thing. Whatever he's doing. Maybe he's working on a different universe. Or in a different part of the universe we have no way of delving the depths of. And if they say, I've mentioned this before, and we all know this, the Hubble telescope took a picture over 10 days. You remember that picture, folks? showing all the galaxies, tens of thousands of galaxies, in what would be, if you hold up your pinky and look at the night sky, it would be about a section of sky about the size of your pinky fingernail. And in that section, they concentrated on that and found tens of thousands of galaxies. Now, take that little tiny spot and spread it over the night sky. Exponentially, mathematically, there are possibly billions of galaxies out there. And like the Milky Way galaxy, how many solar systems do you suppose we have? How many habitable planets do you suppose there are? And so when you do the exponential math, you say, where is God? Is he in any of those other places? Is he doing his thing there as well? Is there a family of gods? Is there, Star Trek fans, a Q continuum? Are they gods in a fictional sense? Is this the kind of thing that's out there? And so we ask those questions. And last night when dealing with Field Guy's statement, I said, I don't know. Why would God allow bad things to happen? Well, maybe he doesn't. Maybe he's the creator, the originator. Who sustains things? Why does God allow bad things to happen? Why does God not answer prayers? Well, that's because sometimes I think we treat God like our lucky rabbit's foot. Something bad happens. Oh, God, let me pray. Oh, God, please don't let this thing happen. Or, God, please help me make sure that paycheck comes in on time. Or, God, help me win the lottery. Blah, blah, blah. God's a lucky rabbit's foot. We pull him out when we need him. And so, being Friday the 13th, by the way, that's a good way to look at God. Is God a lucky rabbit's foot? Is he a superstitious thing for many of us? And so these are the questions we ask. And I'm still on the case of this sleeping God, because I want to continue where we left off with that. But does God sleep? Why do we see, even in biblical text, we saw God's people calling out to him to awake? Psalm 44, if you look at that, it must have been composed under circumstances nearly identical to those related to what we called last night the Deutero-Isaiah, when Israel was scattered among the nations. And the world seems to be collapsing and reverting to chaos. And the psalmist calls on God to awake. And this is what we ended with last night. He says, "Wake up! Why do you sleep, O Lord? Awake, do not cast us off forever. Why do you hide your face? Why do you forget our affliction and oppression? Get up, you must come to our rescue and deliver us for the sake of your steadfast love." Psalm 44. What do you suppose, if we have these, we think of historical atrocities like the sacking of Israel and the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple there, and Babylonia taking all the people that were left alive, taking them captive, hauling them off to Babylonia. And they would pray and ask for God to deliver them. Why have you slept, O God? Why do you not hear our cry? What do you suppose it was like in, I know, touchy topic, concentration camps during World War II? How did the faithful Jews pray to God, saying, "Will you wake up? Do you not see what's being done to your people? Will you not deliver us?" Is the Holocaust the act of a sleeping God, a God who is not present, a God who doesn't exist? The motif of the sleeping deity in the psalm we just read is used to express Israel's belief in Yahweh's absolute kingship. Yahweh's reign is supreme. He can be counted on to awaken, just as he can be counted on to maintain that right order he decrees as creator and sovereign of all. We saw in Israel's past, especially in the pages of Scripture, a cycle where they worshipped God, and then they fell away from God, and then God warned them, and then God sent something to punish them, and then the deliverance, and then they were back to worshiping him, and this cycle kept repeating over and over again. Was the Holocaust something that was part of this cycle that we saw in the biblical cycles? Was God trying to get Israel's attention? I got to tell you, 6 million Jews dying would make a big impression. And that to me doesn't seem, in my finite sense of understanding the world and the way things are, that doesn't seem to be a godly thing to do. So it racks you with confusion. We used to say in my seminary days that the Holocaust was a result of Israel rejecting Jesus as their Messiah. All the pogroms in Europe down through the ages. And I think that's wrong-headed thinking, but that's what we kind of thought at the time. We thought God's trying to shake Israel up and get their attention, say, hey, the Messiah's come. And we earnestly believed that. It wasn't an anti-Semitic thing. It was a thing saying we love the Jews, we honor the Jewish people, they're God's children, God's going to come back to them after this time of grace in the time scale, the eschatological scale of time. But God wants all Jews to turn to Him as well. That was our whole message when it came to talking about that aspect of our history. And yet, why would God allow 6 million people to die if He truly existed? So these were the questions that were raised. Now, we've already quoted from, and by the way, I just didn't do that topic justice at all, but it exists out there, believe me. And it's not from people who are anti-Semitic that believe that. It's from very religious people. We've already quoted from Psalm 74 in connection with God's contest with the sea monsters in the act of creation. But here, too, the psalmist is recalling this act of creation in the context of the Babylonian exile. We shouldn't be surprised, therefore, if he then calls upon God to arise, get out of bed, do something about the enemy who scoffs at him. Do you think the Holocaust was something that the people who perpetrated it was something they were doing to honor God? No. So the people would say, why would you let somebody do this to your people? Psalm 7, 35, 59. These are all laments of the individual, and it's difficult to date them or place them in a historical context. Though in dire straits, the psalmist in each case has confidence that God's going to vindicate him. Typically, he calls on God to arise, to wake up. Psalm 35 says, you have seen, O Yahweh. Do not remain silent. My Lord, be not far from me. Arise, wake up, for the sake of my justice. My God and my Lord, for the sake of my cause. How many people do you suppose who suffered at the hands of the Catholic Church's Inquisition prayed a prayer like that? God, you see what's happening. How can you remain silent? Don't be far away from me. Arise, wake up for the sake of my justice. My God and my Lord, for the sake of my cause. And how many of those people still went to the flame or were still executed? Behind psalms like that lie these vestiges of the ancient Near Eastern motif of the sleeping deity. Portraying Yahweh as asleep was a culturally conditioned theological statement to the effect that Yahweh is the creator and the absolute king of heaven and earth existed. And within Israelite monotheism, there are no other gods to challenge Yahweh's supremacy. But primeval chaos could be translated as the power of evil. Human unrighteousness, injustice transgressing God's righteous decrees. That continues the attack upon His sovereignty. The appeal to Yahweh to wake up is far from being a slur on the effectiveness of divine rule, but was actually an extension of Israel's faith in Yahweh and His universal rule. God continuously suppresses every recrudescence of chaos or evil in the universe. And of course, the motif of sleeping deity can be, and was, turned around. The image of the divine king who does not sleep is a statement that God is eternally vigilant in maintaining the order he's ordained. Not even the slightest evil will be tolerated. This conviction is the source of Psalm 121, which says this. You've heard this before. I lift my eyes to the hills. From whence comes my help? My help is from Yahweh, maker of heaven and earth. He does not let your foot slip. Your guardian does not slumber. He never stumbles nor sleeps, the guardian of Israel. Yahweh is your guardian, your shelter at your right hand. The sun cannot harm you by day, nor the moon by night. Yahweh guards you, body and soul, against every evil. Yahweh guards your coming and your going, and it's forever. So the image of God is never sleeping, like its opposite, functioned in Israel as an effective expression of her faith in Yahweh as the creator and the king, whose control over the universe is absolute and eternal. Remember Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king who went mad for 7 years, and then he wakes up and he looks up. He says, the first thing I'm going to say is that I praise and extol the God of heaven, Daniel's God. I praise him, for he can bring men low and he can raise them again. And I praise him as the high king of heaven. And he is benevolent over all mankind. This was Nebuchadnezzar said this. Now, we don't have historical context for that other than the Bible itself. Did it actually happen? I don't know. There it is. Of course, the image of God sleeping and awaking, and that of its opposite, never sleeping, reflect the language and the metaphor of poetry. In times of peace and prosperity, the psalmist praises God for his wakeful vigilance in having warded off evil. And in times of trouble and distress, the psalmist might feel abandoned by God, as if God were asleep and unconcerned about the crisis that his faithful face. So the metaphors are natural enough, and the reader easily accepts them, despite the fact that a deity who sleeps on the one hand and who is ever vigilant on the other seems contradictory, and it's a certain poetic license that's involved. And I've tried to show that the poetic license isn't the whole story. The image of the deity which sleeps, and vice versa, is a frequent motif in ancient Near Eastern culture and myth. And the history of this myth lies behind and enriches all these biblical images. In appropriating this motif, the biblical authors found a powerful and an effective vehicle for making theological statements about God, both as creator and redeemer. So is it man-made? Or is it just man's reaction to what they know existed? Let's talk about this more when we come back after the break.
Are you looking
folks, thanks for sitting on through that break. Welcome back to the show. This is Scotty Roberts. This is segment 2 of tonight's Intrepid radio program. We're talking about some stuff about God. Now, we could apply this to all our politics and stuff like that. We can make application in a broad swath, but let's just carry on with where we've been. By the way, you can listen to this show in its audio format over at Odyssey Radio, and that's at ODYSY1.com. And you can come and watch the video simulcast of this show over on my YouTube channel, and that's youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. And while you're there, you can join the live chat room, which is going on right now. Excited bunch of folks. They've got a lot of input. Get to know them, the other Intrep heads. They're over there. So come on over to my YouTube channel. Check it out. Subscribe. Hit the little bell, and you'll get notifications every day when the show comes to air. Now, in talking about this stuff of God, as much as I don't want this show to be a show about politics, I don't want this to be a show about religion. Although we hit both of these topics, I do want this show to talk about all these things, though. So, in talking about God, I'm not trying to promote one particular religion. Although, if you're Muslim, you're going to say, you sure don't show the Muslim aspect of this. Maybe I don't, and there probably is one that I could be teaching. But I'm sticking in what I know, Judeo-Christian motifs. And so that's my leaping off point, so to speak, for a lot of this. And I do make a lot of biblical reference. I could talk about a lot of this stuff from a pagan point of view, from the many different gods that are involved in these things. But I don't, although I have in the past. So let's just look at this. I'm doing a little biblical expose, because this is the way many of us were raised. This is what many of us have believed or still believe. And so it's worth looking at from that aspect. So in talking about this whole idea of the sleeping God, the final stage in the biblical adaptation of this motif comes in the New Testament story of Jesus calming the sea. It's found in all three synoptic Gospels of Mark, Matthew, and Luke. It's not in John. And Jesus is in a boat on the Sea of Galilee with his disciples, and after a long time, it says he falls asleep in the stern of the boat. And a sudden storm arises, and waves engulf the boat. And in the words of the Gospel of Matthew, it says, "And they went and woke him, saying, 'Save us, Lord! We're perishing!'" Matthew 8:25, "And Jesus awakes, and then he rose up and rebuked the winds and the sea, and there was a great calm." But in a related story in one of the other Gospels, Jesus not only calms the water and stops the wind, but he also walks on the water. That's in Matthew, Mark, and that one you'll find in the book of John. And for the evangelists, the special significance of these stories was revelatory. It revealed who Jesus is. He was God. He had mastery over weather. He had mastery over the elements. He could stop the storm and the wind and the waves, and they could get out and walk on top of the water. And so it's evident that they regarded these stories as epiphanic, if that's the way you want to say it. They were epiphanies. That is, as manifesting the divine presence of God. That's what these things were about. You can go look at, there's an article that I looked at and I think you should look at. It was written by John Heil, H-E-I-L. It's entitled Jesus Walking on the Sea, the Meaning and Gospel Functions of Matthew, Mark, and John. And you can find that, if you can find the book, it's Analecta Biblica, and it's from Rome's Bible Institute. So just as Jesus walks on the high places or the back of the sea, as Job 9:8 calls these places, so does Jesus. I'm sorry, just as Yahweh walked on the high places, the backbone of the sea, as it's mentioned in Job 9:8, so does Jesus. Just as Yahweh awakes and calms the raging sea, so does Jesus. Whether Jesus' stilling of the sea retained an age-old connotation of a battle against the chaos monster, as in Job 26 and Psalm 89, 10 to 11 in Hebrew, or only the power of the Creator to control his creatures, as in Psalm 107. Jesus is clearly depicted as exercising divine magic, divine power, divine control. Who is this that even the wind and the sea obey him? The question is asked by the disciples in Mark, Matthew, and Luke. So previous commentators have missed the point entirely when they interpret Jesus' sleep as an indication of his humanness. Because he's fatigued by the demands of the crowd that they've made on him, he's forced to seek refuge in the boat, where he promptly falls asleep. Closer still, but still wide of the mark, are those who interpret Jesus' ability to sleep peacefully and undisturbed as a sign of his perfect trust in the protective power of God the Father. But it's not the faith of Jesus, but of his disciples that's on trial here. This is the only passage in the New Testament in which Jesus sleeps. Obviously, the evangelists attach special significance to it. And the image of the sleeping Jesus is modeled after the sleeping divine king, the sleeping God taking his divine rest. His sleeping indicates not powerlessness, but the fullness of absolute rule. The power of the demonic kingdom is only apparent, not real. As is evident when Jesus awakes and stills the raging sea, just as an ancient tradition required of one possessing divine authority. And so these are things about the sleeping God that I think are worth looking at. And it's worth looking at who is God? Who is the universal God? And there's something I want to kind of segue into here when we're talking about the origins of God. The sleeping God is a picture of the God who conquered over the monster at creation and then created what exists. So I want to talk about the genesis of Genesis. Let's move into that. Is the creation story... Now we're getting off the sleep topic and moving in. I've got this next in my notes. That is the creation story a story of the Babylonian creation story. On December 3rd of 1872, George Smith, a former banknote engraver turned Assyriologist, stunned the Western world by announcing that he had discovered a Babylonian story of a great flood resembling the well-known account of the deluge in the book of Genesis, Noah and the Ark. And this amazed people that there was another account out there like this, only it didn't involve the biblical characters. So 4 years after this, Smith published a collection of Mesopotamian myths and the heroic legends entitled The Chaldean Account of Genesis. Chaldean being a synonym for Babylonian, used in the Bible. And the book included Smith's own English translation and discussion of a Babylonian creation myth and other mythological compositions that he'd pieced together from cuneiform fragments, discovering During the process that took a quarter of a century by British excavations at Kuyunik, ancient Nineveh, and it's about the Babylonian creation myth. And Smith wrote this. He said, "The story, so far as I can judge from the fragment, agrees generally with the account of the creation in the book of Genesis, but shows traces of having originally included very much more material." And so now, according to Smith, the biblical account of the 7 days of creation, which you can find in Genesis 1 through Genesis 2, also known as the priestly creation account, quoted in full, was simply an abbreviated Hebrew version of a more ancient Babylonian text. Now, how many times have I told you that the creation story, and I wrote about this in my own books, how the Genesis creation story borrowed its information from the Babylonian or the Sumerian, the Mesopotamian creation stories, with the gods of the Anunnaki being Enlil, Elil, the chief god, Enki, Ea, these gods. And a century and a quarter after Smith made his astounding announcement, the Babylonian creation myth, now regularly called by its Akkadian name, the Enuma Elish, after the first two words meaning when above, is widely recognized for its great importance to the history of ancient Mesopotamian religion. But for most Bible readers, the significance of Enuma Elish lies in its perceived connection to the creation story in Genesis 1:1 through 2:4, and a few other biblical passages relating to the creation and to a primordial conflict between the Israelite deity Yahweh and some vicious sea monsters, as we talked about already. Now, the notion that the biblical creation story depends heavily on Enuma Elish is so entrenched that most common commentaries, modern commentaries on Genesis, mention that connection, that crossover. And any compendium of ancient Near Eastern texts related to the Bible will include Enuma Elish. And the curriculum for teaching Bible in secular Israeli high schools has been revised to include the teaching of Enuma Elish. Nahum Sarna's classic Understanding Genesis devotes 4 pages to the myth. Alexander Heidel's widely used collection of Mesopotamian creative myths, the Babylonian Genesis, it wasn't written for professional Assyriologists, but rather for the Old Testament scholars and the Christian ministers, lends 58 pages to parallels between the Babylonian and the biblical texts. By the way, this is Alexander Heidel's book, The Babylonian Genesis. It was published in 1951 at the University of Chicago. You can still find that book. But was George Smith right, is the question. Was the author of the Genesis creation account heavily influenced by this ancient Babylonian tale? And to answer this, we first have to ask, what is Enuma Elish? First and foremost, it's a poem. The Enuma Elish is a poem. It consists of 1,059 lines written in the Akkadian language and inscribed in cuneiform on 7 tablets. And the story that this great poem tells us is a myth. That is, it explains the world as a reflection of divine activities and relationships between gods. The poem begins on tablet 1. It's the timeless, mythic past when nothing existed apart from 2 personified masses of water, Tiamat, the sea water, and Apsu, the spring water. And these proto-divine male and female figures engaged in an endless mingling of their own waters that we might call the Big Bang. And so such dalliance led inevitably to pregnancy of both partners and the birth of several gods. And as time passed, the baby gods grew into big gods, who were a rowdy bunch partying constantly at home, which happened to be the watery realm that was the body of Tiamat. And this wild behavior raised the ire of Apsu, who was as tyrannical as as haggard fathers throughout time, decided to end it all and kill the kids and the kids' kids and their kids' kids' kids, too. And he plotted the act with his vizier Mumu. But the dastardly design got out, giving the young ones a chance to defend themselves. And to be sure, one of the younger gods, Ea, who is Enki, ended up killing his great-great-grandfather, Apsu, stripping him of his divine regalia and building his own house on the body of his slain ancestor. Ea, Enki, and his spouse, Damkina, immediately moved in, and the two of them set about making love, screwing on the tabletop, the top of the refrigerator, out in the stable, in the living room, in the bathroom, on the floor, everywhere. And they had a baby. And they named him Marduk. So now, the newborn infant was no regular lad. He had 4 pairs of eyes, so he had 8 eyes. And he had 4 pairs of ears, 8 ears. And compare the 4-faced creature of Ezekiel 1:6. And you're going to get an idea. And Ezekiel 1:6 just talks about each of the beasts had 4 faces and 4 wings. And it made him very attentive and gave him excellent peripheral vision. You can imagine if you got 8 eyes, you got pretty good vision. But he grew up rapidly and he became a bit obstreperous. His favorite game was throwing dust into a set of 4 winds, a present from his grandfather, Enuma. Here, I'm going to give you the 4 winds, child. Look at how he throws dust into the winds. How perfect. What a great little boy. And the muddying up of the great-great-great-granny Tiamat. And this childish behavior may not have disturbed recently widowed and long-suffering Tiamat, but it did get on the nerves of the gods living within her. And they, playing on her sense of guilt over having failed to come to the aid of her late husband, cajole and convince her to take up arms and put an end to Marduk's intolerable behavior and their consequent suffering. So in order to do the task, she was certain Umu Huber, the name means mother noise, Umu Huber, produce mother noise. What a great name. Umu Huber, remember that one. Produce for her a SWAT team of 11 raging poisonous monsters, at whose head she appoints the king, the god Kingu. Now, Tablet 2. The younger gods, threatened by these scary beasts, fly into a panic and they start looking for someone to come to their rescue. Ea, Enki, got word of the war and their preparations, and first approaches his grandfather Ansar, the deified horizon, and then Daddy Enuma, the sky god. And he reports the dire situation, but they don't come to the rescue. So Chicken Little style, the whole bunch of them ends up appealing for help from none other than the ultimate cause of their woes, Marduk. And Marduk opportunistically accepts the invitation on the condition that if he defeats Tiamat and saves the gods, they will obey his commands, and so he will be their supreme, unchallenged ruler. In Tablet 3, in order to conclude an agreement, as envoy named Gaga is dispatched to Lamu and Lahuma, Lamu, Lahmu, and Laamu, Ansar's parents. And all the gods gather at a great banquet with lots of eating and drinking, and then when they're sufficiently inebriated, they ratify the agreement and enthrone Marduk as number 1 god. And this is very interesting. It makes this crucial decisions at parties while all drinking and under the influence and inebriated. It's reminiscent of how decisions are made in the court of King Atrahasis, according to the book of Esther. Asurusus, in the book of Esther, in the Bible. So now we come to Tablet 4 of the Enuma Elish. At the enthronement celebration, Marduk is asked to prove the power of his word by making a constellation vanish and reappear, which he immediately does. Oh, there, boom, poof, poof. He spoke with his mouth, and the constellation disappeared. He spoke again with his mouth, and the constellation was formed, it says in the tablets. The text tells us this. And after the display of verbal creativity, the gods outfit him with royal regalia, arm him, and send him off to meet Tiamat. Now the myth reaches its climax in an extensive duel, or a decisive duel, between champion Marduk and Tiamat. And it's a duel to the death. Marduk arms himself with a bow and an arrow, and a mace and a net and 4 winds, probably the toy that Enuma had given him as a child, and 7 special winds designated to get inside Tiamat and give her gas. How's he going to defeat her? He's going to gas her up. Here, eat this chili. And so he mounts a chariot drawn by the winds that can apparently move in all 4 directions. For armor and headgear, he dons terrifying divine radiance. And lest he be wounded, he also carries in his mouth an incantation, and holds in his hand a plant for warding off poison. So, fully suited and geared up, Marduk goes off to find Tiamat. And when he meets her, they engage in a war of words, and finally they lock in battle. And at this point, Marduk opens his net with an intent of bagging her in it, and then the wicked wind, which was sneezing behind him, he directed into her face. Now, this is surely a thinly veiled way of saying that he broke wind in her face. I fart in your general direction. Sounds very Monty Python-ish. And as if this weren't enough, Tiamat opens her mouth wide to swallow the wind dispatched from the rear, but in the end she fills up with the wind, the gas. Pumbaa, with you, everything is gas, if you remember that reference if you're a parent. And so she swallows the wind, and she fills up with it, developing stomach cramps and constipation. So finally Marduk shoots his arrow at her and splits her belly. And with Tiamat defeated, now listen, wait, an innocent reader of this passage of the Enuma Elish is going to certainly break out laughing. This is all about gas. It's from the comic scene. But there's an additional dimension to this description, which, be it primary or secondary, is intentional. And this dimension is revealed in an ancient Assyrian cultic commentary that reads, "The king who opens the barrel in the race is Marduk, who captured Tiamat with his penis." You get that? So it's Sa'ina Usarisu Tiamat Ikmu. And it's reasonable to assume that Marduk's sexual organ is none other than the arrow mentioned in the Enuma Elish. That's his weapon. And I mean, all us guys like to think that. We're like, hey, swing! There's my weapon. The sword has been unsheathed. And so the commentator has sensed the obscene nature of the original text and has been drawn to it. And we too need to give it kind of this proper heed. And as it's well known, sexual and anal humor go hand in hand. Just listen to Rocky's show, and when Rocky and I were doing the show, you get the idea. And this applies to Mesopotamian humor as well. Ancient Mesopotamians joked around about penises and anuses and gas. And it seems, therefore, that the sexual humor of the commentary has been piqued by the anal humor in the text. And so the specific stimulus being the reference to the evil wind going behind Marduk. Find that an interesting commentary on that text? But you never knew that. Yeah, and you know what? Ancients joked around about penises too, and anuses, and gas. Do you think that there were ancients out there that didn't go, hey, my dick's as big as a newborn baby. Yeah, 9 pounds and 18 inches. Or whatever, They went for that same humor, and they wrote it into their mythologies. But it was a thing of importance in that. So, with the Tiamat now defeated and literally deflated, The gods supporting her go into hiding, and the 11 terrible monsters are captured and led away. And so finally Marduk captures Kingu, the god who was leading the monsters, and he takes away the tablets of destiny that Tiamat had given him before the battle. The war over and the enemy rounded up, Marduk returns to his captive Tiamat. He splits her open. He splits her head open with his mace, and he has the wind blow away her blood. He next splits her body like a drying fish. He creates the heavens in the upper half and establishes there a divine dwelling place, Esara, which is the mirror image of Ea's subterranean dwelling place, the Apsu. Remember I talked about how Enki, Ea, would come out of the great Apsu, and he would take his boat into the Serpent's Marsh. That's where Ea lived. So tablet 5, at this point, creation, or rather the ordering of the known world, starts. Working more or less from top to bottom, Marduk instills in the appropriate parts of Tiamat's corpse the heavenly bodies in the heavens, meteorological phenomena in the atmosphere and the mountains, subterranean waters, the Euphrates and the Tigris, the bond of heaven and earth, the netherworld and the oceans in and on the earth. Marduk then celebrates his triumph by distributing trophies and displaying vanquished enemies. He dons royal garments, and the gods declare him king and accept his authority. He then proposes to build Babylon to serve as a lodging place for the gods who go up and down between the subterranean Apsu and the heavenly Esara. Now compare Genesis 28, 10 through 22, in which Jacob dreams of angels ascending and descending a staircase that reaches to the heavens. The gods eagerly accept this proposal. And then, of course, in tablets 6 and 7, before Marduk carries out his plan, he decides to help relieve the gods of their work by creating man. Actually, creating man is only his suggestion, for the actual act is carried out by his father Ea, Enki. The creation of man is described only briefly and elliptically, and we learn only that man was made from the blood of Kingu, who was slaughtered as punishment for having led the rebel gods. And having created man, the gods proceed to carry out Marduk's plan to build Babylon, and in particular its main temple, Esagila. The gods mold bricks for a year, and when the temple is finally in its place as a rest stop between subterranean Apsu and heavenly Esara, all the gods of heaven and the underworld sit down together at a grand dedication banquet. And this ceremony is another opportunity for reaffirming allegiance to Marduk and glorifying him by proclaiming his 50 names, along with intricate explanations of each one. By the way, you notice how many names does God have in the Old Testament? There's a lot. I don't think there's quite 50, but there's a lot of them. Now the poem concludes, the word of Marduk, who created the Igigi gods, his, or its, let them, his name let, and by the way, there's breaks in this because there was breaks in the cuneiform. His name let them, blank comma, his name let them invoke. Let them sound abroad the song of Marduk, how he defeated Tiamat and took kingship. So how much does this strange and exciting tale throughout these 7 cuneiform tablets really resemble the creation account of Genesis 1:1 through 2:4 and other biblical references to creation? What kind of relationship, if any, is there between these texts? The concluding couplet of Enuma Elish, quoted above, suggests one of the most significant differences. Here, as in many Mesopotamian works, the author explains to the readers that the text they have read is what it's really about, and in this case he defines the entire composition as a hymn or song in praise of Marduk, who created the great gods, the Igigi, defeated Tiamat, and then assumed the throne. Compare this with the concluding line of the biblical creation account, Such is the story of heaven and earth when they were created. In short, Genesis is about creation, while the Enuma Elish is about the Creator. So we're going to leave it there, because we're out of time. I want to pick this up because I got a lot more material to go, as you've heard me say many times. It's Friday. Have a good weekend. We'll see you on Sunday morning at 9 a.m. Central Standard Time, right here for It's Sunday. May have rainy in tow on Sunday. And then we'll be back next week on Monday, same time, 10 p.m. Eastern, 9 p.m. Central. And so you guys have a good weekend. We'll see you on Monday when we'll pick this up. And see you on Sunday right in the middle.